The morning sun cast long shadows across the remote military outpost as Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The mess hall kitchen was already sweltering at 6 in the morning, and she knew it would only get worse as the day progressed. The industrial fans overhead did little more than push the hot air around, creating a constant hum that had become the soundtrack to her daily routine. Sarah had been cooking for SEAL Team 7 for 8 months now, ever since she'd been assigned to this classified location somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. It wasn't the assignment she'd dreamed of when she first enlisted in the Navy, but she'd learned to find purpose in feeding the warriors who risked their lives every day. Each meal she prepared could be someone's last hot food before a dangerous mission, and that knowledge drove her to excellence in everything she did. The kitchen was her domain, a place where she could control something in an environment where chaos was always just one radio call away. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and every pot, pan, and utensil had its designated place. Sarah ran her kitchen with military precision, just as she'd been trained. Organization wasn't just about efficiency here, it was about survival. As she began preparing breakfast for 42 men, Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard the night before. Team 7 was planning something big, bigger than their usual reconnaissance missions or targeted strikes. She'd seen the tension in Commander Blake's shoulders when he'd come through the chow line, the way he'd barely touched his food despite her having prepared his favorite meal. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been unusually quiet too, staring at his plate like it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. The sound of boots on linoleum interrupted her thoughts. Petty Officer First Class Thompson pushed through the swinging doors, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite read. Thompson was one of the few team members who actually talked to her beyond pleasantries about the food. He'd grown up on a farm in Iowa and often shared stories about his grandmother's cooking, comparing it favorably to Sarah's own attempts at comfort food. "Morning, Martinez," Thompson said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Commander wants to see you in the briefing room after breakfast service." Sarah's hands paused in their rhythmic chopping of onions. In 8 months, she'd never been called to the briefing room. That space was sacred, reserved for mission planning and classified discussions that support staff like her were never privy to. Did he say what about? Thompson shook his head, but she caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or possibly fear. Just said to come find you after the last man's been fed. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. Sarah found herself paying attention to details she'd normally overlook, the way Sergeant Williams kept checking his watch, how several team members seemed to be eating with unusual urgency, the fact that 3 men she'd expected to see never showed up for breakfast at all. By the time she'd served the last tray and begun cleaning up, a knot of anxiety had formed in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. The briefing room was smaller than she'd imagined, dominated by a large table covered in maps and photographs she couldn't make sense of from where she stood near the door. Commander Blake looked up as she entered, his weathered face showing every one of his 43 years. He'd been leading SEAL teams for 2 decades, and Sarah had heard enough stories to know that he'd seen things that would break lesser men. "Sit down, Martinez," Blake said, gesturing to a chair across from him. "We need to talk." Sarah sat, her back straight despite the casual invitation. Military bearing was second nature now, a armor she wore even in moments of uncertainty. "Sir?" Blake studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room." "Understood?" "Yes, sir. We're moving out tonight. All of us. This is a high-priority extraction mission, and there's significant risk involved." Blake paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "The thing is, Martinez, we need someone to stay behind and maintain the outpost. Someone who can handle communications, keep the equipment running, and hold down the fort until we get back." Sarah felt her heart skip. "Sir, I'm not qualified for that kind of responsibility. I'm a cook, not a communications specialist." "You're selling yourself short," Blake replied. "I've been watching you these past 8 months. You're organized, you're calm under pressure, and you've got good instincts. More importantly, you're the only person I can spare who isn't essential to the mission itself." The weight of what he was asking began to settle on Sarah's shoulders. How long will you be gone? Could be 3 days, could be a week. Hard to say with these kinds of operations. Blake leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm not going to lie to you, Martinez. This isn't without risk. If something goes wrong, if we don't come back, you'll need to contact base command and arrange for extraction. But, if everything goes according to plan, you'll just be babysitting an empty outpost for a few days. Sarah thought about her younger brother back home in Texas, about the promise she'd made to their mother to stay safe and come home in one piece. This wasn't what she'd signed up for, but then, again, nothing about military service ever really was. What exactly would I need to do? Blake spent the next 2 hours walking her through the basics of the communication system, showing her how to operate the radio equipment and satellite uplink that kept them connected to the outside world. The technology was more advanced than anything she'd worked with, but the principles were straightforward enough. He taught her the emergency protocols, the code she'd need if something went catastrophically wrong, and the schedule for routine check-ins with base command. The most important thing, Blake emphasized as they wrapped up the briefing, is that you maintain communication silence unless there's an emergency. We can't risk our mission being compromised because someone intercepted transmissions from here. You check in with base every 12 hours, give them an all clear, and that's it. No chatter, no unnecessary communications. By late afternoon, the outpost had transformed into a hive of activity. Sarah watched from the kitchen as team members loaded gear into vehicles, checked weapons, and made final preparations for their departure. The mood was focused and professional, but she could sense the underlying tension that came with any dangerous mission. These men had trained together, fought together, and some of them might not be coming back together. Sergeant Williams stopped by the kitchen just before they rolled out. He was the team's medic, a soft-spoken man from Oregon who joined the Navy to pay for medical school. He'd always been kind to Sarah, asking about her family and sharing pictures of his own wife and young daughter. "Hey, Martinez," he said, setting his gear bag down by the door. "I wanted to thank you for everything these past months. Best food I've had in any deployment, hands down." Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. "Just make sure you come back to eat more of it, Williams." He grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the plan. Listen, I left something in my bunk. If things don't go the way we hope, I'd appreciate it if you could make sure it gets back to my family." The request hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. She'd been thinking of this assignment as temporary babysitting duty, but Williams's words brought home the reality of what these men were facing. "Nothing's going to happen," she said firmly. "You're all coming back." "Sure we are," Williams agreed, shouldering his bag. "But, just in case." As darkness fell, Sarah stood in the doorway of the mess hall and watched the convoy of vehicles disappear into the night, their headlights quickly swallowed by the mountainous terrain. The silence that followed their departure was unlike anything she'd experienced at the outpost. For 8 months, there had always been the sounds of activity, conversations, equipment being maintained, the constant background noise of 42 men living and working in close quarters. Now there was nothing but the wind whistling through the valley and the distant sound of her own breathing. Sarah made her way to the communication center, a small room adjacent to the command post that she'd never paid much attention to before. The banks of equipment hummed quietly, their LED displays casting an eerie green glow in the darkness. She followed Blake's instructions, running through the system checks he'd taught her and confirming that everything was functioning normally. Her first scheduled check-in with base command wasn't until midnight, still 3 hours away. Sarah returned to the kitchen and began preparing for the next day's meals out of habit more than necessity. With the team gone, she'd be cooking only for herself, but the familiar routine of meal preparation helped calm her nerves. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about how she'd ended up here. Growing up in San Antonio, she'd never imagined herself in a military kitchen in Afghanistan, responsible for maintaining an outpost while Navy SEALs carried out classified missions. She joined the Navy to see the world and learn skills that would serve her after her enlistment ended, but somewhere along the way, it had become about more than that. These men had become her responsibility in a way that went beyond simply feeding them. She'd learned their preferences, their stories, their fears and hopes.
Thompson missed his girlfriend back in Iowa and planned to propose when he returned from deployment.
Rodriguez was saving money to help his parents buy a house in California. Commander Blake carried a picture of his son, a Marine serving his own deployment in Iraq. They were her boys, and now they were out there in the darkness, depending on her to keep their home base secure. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. when Sarah made her way back to the communications center. She'd spent the intervening time double-checking the outpost's security measures, ensuring that all doors were locked and that the perimeter sensors were functioning properly. Blake had shown her how to monitor the early warning systems, though he'd assured her that the likelihood of any threat reaching their position was minimal. At exactly midnight, Sarah keyed the radio and made contact with base command. The voice that responded was crisp and professional, requesting confirmation of her identity and the outpost's status. She provided the appropriate codes and reported that all was well, that the team had departed on schedule and that she was maintaining normal operations.
Copy that, Outpost 7. Next scheduled check-in at 1200 hours.
Maintain communication silence until then, unless emergency situation develops.
Understood, base. Outpost 7 out.
Sarah leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a small smile.
One check-in down, however, many to go. Maybe this wouldn't be so difficult after all.
She was competent, she was prepared, and she was ready to prove that a cook could handle whatever responsibilities the Navy threw at her. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the mountains, and somewhere in the darkness, SEAL Team 7 was moving toward their objective. Sarah said a quiet prayer for their safety and began planning how she'd spend the long hours until dawn. She had books to read, equipment to maintain, and the kind of solitude that military life rarely provided. For the first time since Blake had called her to the briefing room, Sarah felt like she might actually enjoy the next few days. The outpost was secure, the communications were functioning perfectly, and she had everything under control.
What could possibly go wrong?
Sarah woke with a start, her hand instinctively reaching for the alarm clock beside her bunk.
3:17 a.m.
She'd only been asleep for 2 hours, but something had pulled her from the deep sleep she'd finally managed to fall into. The outpost was silent except for the usual mechanical hums and the wind outside, but there was something else, something that made her skin crawl with unease. She lay still for several minutes, listening intently. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The silence felt different somehow, heavier than it had when she'd gone to bed. She slipped out of her bunk and padded quietly to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. Nothing moved in the pale circle of illumination that surrounded the outpost. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky, and the valley below was lost in shadow. Sarah shook her head, telling herself she was being paranoid. This was only her first night alone, and it was natural to feel jumpy. She'd been around enough combat veterans to know that hypervigilance was a normal response to unfamiliar situations. But, as she turned away from the window, a faint sound caught her attention. It was barely audible over the ambient noise of the outpost systems, but it was there, the distant rumble of engines. Sarah froze, straining to hear more clearly. The sound grew slightly louder, then faded, as if vehicles were moving through the valley below. Her first thought was that Team 7 was returning early, but that made no sense. They'd only been gone for 7 hours, nowhere near enough time to complete their mission and return. Besides, Blake had been clear that they wouldn't be back for days. The vehicle she was hearing had to belong to someone else. Sarah's mouth went dry as the implications hit her. This outpost was supposed to be secret, its location known only to authorized personnel. If there were vehicles moving through this area in the middle of the night, they weren't friendly. Moving as quietly as she could, Sarah made her way to the communications center. Her hands shook slightly as she powered up the monitoring equipment Blake had shown her, adjusting the sensors to scan the approaches to the outpost. The screen flickered to life, showing a topographical map of the surrounding area with small blips indicating movement. 3 vehicles, moving slowly up the mountain road that led to the outpost. They were still several miles away, but they were definitely heading in her direction. Sarah's training kicked in as she realized she had perhaps 30 minutes before they reached her position. Her first instinct was to radio for help, but Blake's warnings about maintaining communication silence echoed in her head. She wasn't supposed to break radio silence except in case of emergency, and this definitely qualified. But, as she reached for the radio controls, another thought struck her: what if the approaching vehicles were monitoring radio frequencies? A transmission could confirm the outpost's location and warn them that someone was here. Sarah forced herself to think clearly despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had options, but she needed to choose the right one. She could hide and hope the intruders would leave without finding anything of value. She could attempt to contact Base Command and request immediate extraction. Or she could try to determine exactly who these people were and what they wanted. The monitoring station showed more detail as the vehicles drew closer. 3 trucks, moving in tactical formation with their lights extinguished. Definitely not friendly. Sarah realized she was looking at her worst-case scenario. Hostile forces had somehow discovered the outpost's location and were moving to investigate or possibly capture it. 25 minutes until they arrived. Sarah began moving with purposeful efficiency, her culinary training in organization and time management serving her well in this crisis. First, she secured all classified materials, following the protocols Blake had taught her for destroying sensitive documents and computer files. The process took precious minutes, but she couldn't risk letting intelligence fall into enemy hands. Next, she gathered emergency supplies, water, food, first aid kit, and the backup radio equipment. If she had to abandon the outpost, she'd need resources to survive in the mountains until rescue arrived. She also collected the personal items Williams had asked her to safeguard, along with anything else that could identify the team members if they were captured. 18 minutes. The approaching vehicles had reached the base of the mountain. Sarah could see on the monitor that they'd stopped, probably to reconnoiter the area before making their final approach. Professional soldiers, then, not random bandits or Taliban fighters stumbling across the outpost by chance. This was a planned operation. Sarah made her decision. She would evacuate the outpost and observe from a concealed position, gathering intelligence about the intruders while remaining hidden. If they were just conducting a search, she could wait until they left and then contact Base Command. If they were planning to occupy the outpost or lay an ambush for Team 7's return, she'd need that information to warn Blake and his men. 15 minutes. Moving with quiet efficiency, Sarah disabled the outpost's main systems to prevent the intruders from using them. She couldn't destroy everything without creating obvious evidence of recent occupation, but she could make the equipment useless. The communication gear was the priority. She couldn't let hostile forces gain access to Navy frequencies and protocols. She slipped out through the rear exit, carrying her emergency pack and moving toward the rocky outcropping Blake had pointed out during her brief security orientation. From there, she'd have a clear view of the outpost while remaining hidden among the boulders and scrub vegetation. The night air was cold against her face as she climbed carefully up the slope behind the outpost. Her breath came in visible puffs, and she forced herself to breathe slowly and quietly despite her racing heart. Behind her, the outpost sat in its circle of light like a target waiting to be hit. Sarah reached the observation position with minutes to spare. She settled herself among the rocks, adjusting her position until she had a clear line of sight to the outpost while remaining completely concealed. The backup radio was tucked beside her, ready to use if the situation demanded it. The first vehicle appeared on the road below just as Sarah finished her preparations. It moved slowly, deliberately, its occupants clearly scanning for threats. The truck was a Soviet-era design that could have belonged to any number of groups in the region, giving no clue about the identity of its occupants. 2 more vehicles followed, maintaining careful spacing. Sarah counted at least 12 men as they dismounted and began surrounding the outpost. Their movements were coordinated and professional, confirming her assessment that these were trained soldiers rather than opportunistic raiders. Through her small binoculars, Sarah watched as the intruders approached the main building. They moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they were looking for, and her heart sank as she realized this wasn't a random discovery. Someone had told them about the outpost. The leader of the group was a tall man in military-style clothing who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He gestured to his men, dividing them into teams to search the various buildings.
Sarah noted that they were taking care not to damage anything, as if they wanted the outpost to appear undisturbed.
It took them less than 10 minutes to determine that the outpost was currently unoccupied. Sarah watched as the leader gathered his men for what appeared to be a briefing. She was too far away to hear their conversation, but their body language suggested they were disappointed not to find anyone there. That's when Sarah realized the true scope of the danger. These men weren't here to capture the outpost, they were here to capture the people who operated it. They knew about Team 7, and they were planning to wait for the SEALs to return from their mission.
The implications were staggering.
If Team 7 came back to what appeared to be a normal, secure outpost, they'd walk directly into a trap. 12 professional soldiers with prepared positions, and the element of surprise would have overwhelming advantages against even the best SEAL team. Sarah had to warn them, but the team was operating under communication silence during their mission. She couldn't contact them directly, and any transmission to base command would likely be intercepted by the hostile forces now occupying her outpost. As she watched, the intruders began setting up for an extended stay.
They positioned vehicles to block the road, established overwatch positions in the buildings, and settled in to wait.
Their leader seemed particularly interested in the communication center, spending considerable time examining the equipment Sarah had disabled. One of the men approached the leader and handed him something Sarah couldn't see clearly. After examining it, the leader nodded and issued what appeared to be new instructions. Several of his men began moving through the outpost more systematically, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that they were searching for evidence of recent occupation. Her heart pounded as she watched them discover small details she'd overlooked in her hasty evacuation: a still warm coffee pot in the kitchen, food that was obviously fresh, bedding that had recently been slept in. It wouldn't take them long to realize that someone had been here very recently, and, when they did, they'd begin searching the surrounding area.
Sarah had perhaps 20 minutes before they started hunting for her.
She keyed the backup radio with trembling fingers, knowing she had to take the risk. The transmission would be brief and coded, but it might be enough to prevent disaster. Base command needed to know that the outpost was compromised and that Team 7 was walking into an ambush. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Outpost 7, she whispered into the radio. "Outpost compromised, hostile forces in control. Team 7 returning to ambush situation. Request immediate." A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and Sarah felt the cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against her neck. She'd been so focused on the outpost below that she'd failed to notice the sentry climbing up behind her position. Very slowly, an accented voice said softly in her ear, "You will put down the radio and stand up.
Any sudden movements and you will die right here."
Sarah's mind raced as she complied with the gunman's instructions. She'd failed in the most basic way possible, she'd let herself be captured. Now not only was Team 7 still in danger, but she'd lost any chance of warning them or base command about the trap waiting for them. As the gunman marched her down toward the outpost, Sarah caught sight of the leader who'd been directing the operation. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone educated rather than simply trained. When he spoke, his English was excellent despite the slight accent. "Miss Martinez," he said, and Sarah's blood chilled at the realization that he knew her name. "I apologize for the rough treatment, but we couldn't allow you to complete that transmission. We have much to discuss, you and I." The leader gestured for his men to secure the area while he led Sarah into the outpost's main building. As they walked, she noticed details she'd missed from her distant observation point. These men were equipped with modern weapons and gear, they moved with the precision of elite soldiers, and they clearly had detailed intelligence about the outpost and its occupants.
"Who are you?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady.
The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
"My name is Colonel Nazir, and I represent certain interests that have been watching your SEAL team for some time. We know about their mission, Miss Martinez.
We know when they left, where they went, and when they plan to return."
Sarah's worst fears were confirmed.
This wasn't a chance encounter or even routine intelligence gathering. Team 7 had been betrayed, and she was now a prisoner of people who planned to use the outpost as the killing ground for an ambush. "What do you want with me?" she asked. Colonel Nazir studied her for a moment before answering. "You're going to help us, Miss Martinez. When your SEAL team returns, you're going to ensure they enter the outpost without suspicion. You're going to help us capture them alive." The weight of what he was asking hit Sarah like a physical blow. They wanted her to betray the men she'd been cooking for, caring for, and worrying about for 8 months. They wanted her to be the bait that lured Team 7 into their trap. "And if I refuse?" Nazir's expression hardened. "Then, your SEAL friends will still walk into our ambush, but they'll die fighting instead of surrendering. Either way, Miss Martinez, they will not be leaving this outpost alive. The only question is whether you choose to save their lives or watch them die." Sarah looked around the mess hall where she'd spent so many hours preparing meals for men who'd become her family. Now it was occupied by their enemies, and she was being asked to choose between her own principles and their lives. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to show over the mountains, and somewhere out there, Team 7 was completing their mission, unaware that they were heading home to a trap that could destroy them all. Sarah sat in the mess hall chair where Colonel Nazir had placed her, her hands zip-tied behind her back and a guard positioned nearby with orders to watch her every move. The morning sun streamed through the windows she'd looked out of just hours before, when her biggest concern had been whether she had enough coffee to last until Team 7 returned. Now those same windows felt like the walls of a prison. Nazir had been gone for an hour, coordinating with his men as they transformed the outpost into an elaborate trap. Through the kitchen doorway, Sarah could see soldiers repositioning equipment and setting up concealed firing positions. They worked with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, and she realized with sick certainty that Team 7 wasn't their first target. The guard assigned to watch her was a younger man, maybe 25, with nervous energy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Unlike Nazir, who spoke perfect English, this soldier seemed to understand only basic commands. Sarah had tested this theory by asking him several questions in English, receiving only blank stares in response. "Water," Sarah said, making drinking motions with her bound hands. "Please?" The guard looked uncertain, glancing toward the door where Nazir had disappeared. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled a bottle from his gear and held it to Sarah's lips, allowing her to drink. The small kindness gave her hope that not all of Nazir's men were as coldly professional as their commander. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the ambush being prepared. Nazir's men had divided into 3 teams, one group concealed in the barracks building where they could control the main sleeping quarters, another positioned in the motor pool to prevent any escape by vehicle, and a third team hidden in the communication center to jam any attempts at calling for help. The plan was tactically sound and showed intimate knowledge of how SEAL teams operated. Team 7 would return tired from their mission, expecting to find their base secure and their cook preparing a hot meal. They'd enter the outpost in normal patrol formation, weapons relaxed, guards down. By the time they realized the danger, they'd be surrounded and outnumbered 3-1. What troubled Sarah most was how much Nazir knew about Team 7's specific procedures. He'd positioned his men exactly where they'd have the most advantage when the SEALs returned, suggesting he understood their tactics, their timing, even their individual personalities. Someone with detailed knowledge of Team 7 had provided intelligence for this operation. Around midday, Nazir returned to the mess hall carrying a satellite phone and looking pleased with himself. He dismissed the guard with a gesture and took a seat across from Sarah, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reading people's weaknesses. "I've just received confirmation that your SEAL team is returning ahead of schedule," Nazir said conversationally. Their mission was apparently more successful than expected, and they'll be here sometime this evening instead of tomorrow morning. Sarah's heart sank. She'd been hoping for more time, perhaps a chance to escape or at least find some way to warn the team. Now she had perhaps 8 hours before Blake and his men walked into Nazir's trap. "You still have a choice to make, Miss Martinez," Nazir continued. "I'm told you've become quite close to these men during your assignment here. Surely you'd prefer to see them captured alive rather than killed in a futile firefight. What guarantees do I have that you'll honor your word?" Sarah asked. "How do I know you won't kill them anyway once you have them?"
Nazir smiled, and this time it seemed almost genuine. You don't, of course. But consider the alternatives. If they walk into this outpost unsuspecting, they'll fight, and they'll die. These are Navy SEALs, Miss Martinez. They'll never surrender willingly, and my men will have no choice but to kill them all. But if they're warned somehow, if they approach with caution, they might have a chance. They might, Nazir agreed. But then, again, they might simply call for reinforcements and turn this into a larger battle that serves no one's interests. No, Miss Martinez, the cleanest solution for everyone involved is for them to surrender peacefully. Sarah studied Nazir's face, trying to read his intentions. He was clearly intelligent and professional, but there was something about his manner that suggested he genuinely believed he was offering her the best available option. Either he was an exceptionally skilled manipulator, or he actually intended to keep his word about taking the team alive. What exactly do you want from them? Sarah asked. Why is capturing SEAL Team 7 worth this much effort and risk? Nazir was quiet for a long moment, as if debating how much to reveal. When he spoke again, his tone was more serious than before. Let's just say that certain parties are very interested in learning more about recent American special operations in this region. Your SEAL team has been quite active, and there are questions that need answers. The implication was clear. Nazir wanted to interrogate Team 7 about their missions, their intelligence sources, their operational methods. Sarah realized she was looking at a sophisticated intelligence operation, not a simple ambush or kidnapping attempt. How do you know so much about them? She asked. Nazir's expression grew guarded. That's not your concern, Miss Martinez. Your concern is whether you're going to help save their lives or watch them die. Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Nazir's men continued their preparations, and she could see the trap taking shape with professional precision. Every possible escape route was covered, every tactical advantage neutralized. If Team 7 walked into this outpost unprepared, they would indeed face overwhelming odds. But helping Nazir meant betraying everything she'd sworn to uphold when she joined the Navy. It meant actively participating in the capture of American servicemen and potentially compromising ongoing operations that could affect countless other lives. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like a physical burden. As afternoon faded into evening, Nazir returned with news that changed everything. I've just received an update from our observation posts, he said, settling into his usual chair across from Sarah. Your SEAL team isn't coming alone. They're bringing someone with them. Sarah's blood chilled. What do you mean? It appears their mission involved extracting a high-value target, Nazir explained. Someone important enough that they're bringing this person directly here instead of to a standard debriefing facility. This is an unexpected bonus for our operation. The implications hit Sarah like a hammer blow. Team 7 hadn't just been on a routine mission, they'd been rescuing someone, probably an intelligence asset or defector with critical information. Now not only were Blake and his men walking into a trap, but they were bringing exactly the kind of person Nazir's handlers would be most interested in capturing. You see why your cooperation is even more important now, Nazir continued. The stakes have been raised considerably. If this becomes a firefight, not only will your SEAL friends die, but so will the person they risked their lives to save. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to think clearly despite the overwhelming pressure of the situation. Every instinct told her that helping Nazir was wrong, that she should find some way to warn Team 7 even if it meant her own death. But the cold logic of the situation was undeniable. If she refused to cooperate, Blake and his men would die fighting, and their rescued asset would be captured anyway. When she opened her eyes again, Nazir was watching her with patient attention, as if he could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. What exactly do you want me to do? She asked quietly. Nazir leaned forward, his expression becoming businesslike. When they arrive, you'll greet them normally. You'll express relief at their safe return, ask about their mission in general terms, and guide them into the mess hall for what they'll expect to be a debriefing meal. Once they're all inside and relaxed, my men will reveal themselves and demand their surrender. And if they don't surrender? Then, you'll encourage them to do so, Nazir replied. You'll tell them that resistance is futile, that they're outnumbered and surrounded, and that their best option is to comply with our demands. Coming from you, someone they trust, such advice will carry more weight than if it came from us. Sarah felt sick at the thought of betraying the men who treated her like family, but she also couldn't ignore the brutal mathematics of the situation. Team 7 was walking into a perfectly planned ambush with a rescued civilian in tow. Their chances of fighting their way out were minimal, and the cost of failure was the deaths of everyone involved. I need guarantees, she said finally. If I do this, I want your word that no one will be hurt as long as they cooperate. Nazir nodded solemnly. You have my word, Miss Martinez. No harm will come to any of them as long as they surrender peacefully and cooperate with our debriefing process. What happens to them after that? That decision will be made by others, but I can tell you that dead prisoners serve no one's interests. The goal is intelligence gathering, not revenge. As darkness fell outside the mess hall windows, Sarah found herself committed to a course of action that felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything she believed in. But, with the lives of Blake, Thompson, Williams, Rodriguez, and the rest of Team 7 hanging in the balance, she couldn't see any other choice that offered even a slim chance of keeping them alive. Nazir's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. After a brief conversation in a language Sarah didn't recognize, he turned to her with a satisfied expression. They're 20 minutes out, he announced. It's time to prepare for our guest's arrival. The colonel's men moved into their final positions with practiced efficiency, disappearing into shadows and concealment that would be invisible to the returning SEAL team. Sarah was positioned at the main entrance, her restraints removed but with clear instructions about the consequences of any attempt to warn the approaching Americans. As vehicle lights appeared on the mountain road below, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the men she'd been feeding and caring for 8 months lived or died. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but there was no turning back now. Team 7 was coming home, and Sarah Martinez, their cook and the person they trusted to keep their base secure, was about to deliver them directly into the hands of their enemies. The convoy's headlights cut through the darkness as 3 vehicles wound up the mountain road toward the outpost. Sarah stood in the doorway of the main building, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Behind her, hidden in the shadows, Colonel Nazir's men waited in perfect silence for Team 7 to enter their trap. Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds before the vehicles reached the outpost perimeter. 90 seconds to make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that might be. She could feel Nazir's eyes on her from his concealed position, watching for any sign that she might try to warn the returning SEALs. As the lead vehicle passed through the outer security checkpoint, Sarah made her choice. Instead of standing passively in the doorway as Nazir expected, she stepped forward into the light and began waving her arms frantically over her head. It was a signal any military person would recognize immediately as distress, a clear warning that something was wrong. Martinez. Nazir's sharp whisper came from behind her, but Sarah ignored him, continuing to signal as the convoy approached. The lead vehicle's headlights blinked once, twice, 3 times in acknowledgement. Commander Blake had seen her signal and understood its meaning. The convoy immediately changed formation, vehicles spreading apart and slowing as the SEAL team shifted into combat mode. Sarah felt hands grab her arms and yank her back into the building, but it was too late. The warning had been given, and Team 7 was now approaching with full awareness that the outpost was compromised. Stupid girl, Nazir hissed as his men dragged Sarah away from the door. You've just signed their death warrants. Maybe, Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. But at least they'll die fighting instead of walking blindly into your trap. Outside, the night erupted into chaos as Team 7's vehicles came under fire from Nazir's concealed positions. The SEALs had stopped well short of the main building, using their vehicles as cover while they assessed the situation. Return fire began immediately, precise and devastating as the highly trained Special Operations team responded to the ambush. Nazir barked orders in his native language as his carefully planned operation began falling apart. His men had been positioned for a surprise capture, not a prolonged firefight against alerted Navy SEALs. The tactical advantage he'd spent hours establishing was evaporating as Team 7 demonstrated exactly why they were considered among the world's elite soldiers.
Through the windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes and the controlled movement of Blake's men as they maneuvered for better positions. These weren't the relaxed, off-guard soldiers Nasir had expected to capture. These were warriors in their element, and they were angry about finding their home base occupied by hostile forces.
Rodriguez, Thompson, flank left.
Blake's voice cut through the noise of battle, clear and commanding despite the chaos.
Williams, stay with the package.
Sarah's heart leaped as she heard the familiar voices of men she'd been worried about for days. They were alive, they were fighting, and they had successfully completed their mission to rescue whatever high-value target they'd been sent to extract. An explosion rocked the building as one of Team 7's grenades found its mark among Nasir's men. The colonel was no longer the calm, confident officer who'd been interrogating Sarah hours earlier. His face was tight with fury as he realized his intelligence operation was turning into a bloody disaster.
Suppressing fire on the motor pool, Blake commanded.
We need those vehicles neutralized. Nasir's men responded with professional competence, but they were clearly outmatched by the SEAL's superior training and equipment. What had been planned as a simple ambush was becoming a tactical nightmare as Team 7 systematically destroyed their prepared positions. Sarah found herself crouched behind an overturned table in the mess hall, watching the battle unfold through broken windows. One of Nasir's men stumbled through the doorway, bleeding from a shoulder wound and looking shaken by the intensity of the SEAL team's counterattack. They're moving to surround the building, the wounded soldier reported to Nasir.
Team 2 is requesting permission to fall back to secondary positions. Nasir's jaw clenched as he assessed his rapidly deteriorating situation.
His ambush had failed completely, his men were taking casualties, and the SEALs were methodically dismantling his operation with lethal efficiency.
The colonel was facing the nightmare scenario of every intelligence officer, a blown operation with nowhere to retreat.
Sir, another of Nasir's men approached cautiously. The Americans are jamming our communications.
We can't contact extraction. Sarah almost smiled at that news.
Blake and his team weren't just defending themselves, they were ensuring that Nasir's forces couldn't call for reinforcements or report the failure of their mission.
Team 7 was systematically cutting off every avenue of escape or support for their enemies.
A new voice joined the battle outside, speaking crisp English with what sounded like a British accent.
American forces, this is Agent Harrison.
I am the asset your team was sent to extract. I have critical intelligence about hostile operations in this region, including the identity of the individuals who betrayed your position. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications of what she'd just heard. The person Team 7 had rescued wasn't just any intelligence asset, it was someone with specific knowledge about the betrayal that had led to this ambush. Someone who could identify whoever had provided Nasir with detailed information about Team 7's operations. Nasir's face had gone pale as he heard Agent Harrison's words. If this British intelligence officer had information about the source of the leak, it meant Nasir's entire network was potentially compromised. The failed ambush was suddenly the least of his problems. We need to get out of here, one of Nasir's lieutenants urged. Before they complete the encirclement. But escape was already impossible. Through the windows, Sarah could see Team 7's systematic advance as they cleared the outpost building by building. These men knew every inch of this facility, every hiding place and defensive position. They were fighting on their home ground against invaders, and their rage at finding their base compromised was driving them to devastating effectiveness.
Martinez.
Blake's voice boomed from outside, amplified by some kind of speaker system.
If you're alive in there, give us a signal.
Sarah looked at Nasir, who was watching her with desperate calculation in his eyes. She could see him weighing options, trying to find some way to salvage his mission or at least escape with his life. The confident intelligence officer had been replaced by a trapped animal looking for any way out. He's going to try to use you as a hostage, Sarah realized aloud. Nasir's hand moved toward his sidearm, confirming her suspicion, but Sarah was already moving. 8 months of working in a military kitchen had built strength and reflexes she hadn't possessed when she first arrived at the outpost. She grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the nearest counter and swung it with all her strength at Nasir's gun hand. The weapon went flying as Nasir cried out in pain and surprise. Sarah didn't hesitate, she sprinted toward the door, shouting at the top of her lungs.
"Blake! I'm coming out.
The building is clear except for wounded hostiles." She burst through the doorway into the night air, immediately dropping to the ground as Blake had taught all base personnel to do if they ever found themselves in a combat zone. Strong hands grabbed her arms and pulled her toward cover behind one of the vehicles.
"Jesus, Martinez," Thompson's familiar voice said as he helped her to safety.
"We thought they'd killed you when we saw those other vehicles."
"I'm okay," Sarah gasped, looking around at the faces of men she'd feared she might never see again. "But there are wounded hostiles in the building, including their commander.
He has detailed intelligence about Team 7 operations." Commander Blake appeared beside them, his face grim in the darkness.
"How many total?" 12 originally, Sarah reported. "I count at least 4 casualties from the fighting."
"The leader is Colonel Nazir, and he knows way too much about your missions and procedures."
Blake nodded grimly. "Agent Harrison briefed us on the intelligence leak. We've got a lot of cleaning up to do."
Over the next hour, Sarah watched as Team 7 methodically secured the outpost and processed the surviving members of Nazir's force. The SEALs worked with professional efficiency, treating wounded enemies according to the Geneva Convention while gathering intelligence about the failed operation. Agent Harrison turned out to be a slight, intense woman in her 40s who spoke with Sarah at length about her experience with Nazir. The British intelligence officer was particularly interested in everything the colonel had revealed about his knowledge of Team 7's operations. "Your warning saved not just these men's lives, but potentially dozens of other operations," Harrison told Sarah as they sat in the mess hall that had become her prison just hours earlier. Colonel Nazir was part of a sophisticated network that's been tracking American special operations across the region.
"How did they know so much about us?" Sarah asked. Harrison's expression darkened.
"That's still under investigation, but there are indications of a high-level security breach somewhere in the command structure."
What happened here tonight was just the tip of a very large iceberg.
As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah found herself back in her kitchen, preparing breakfast for Team 7 and their unexpected guests. The familiar routine of cooking felt surreal after the night's events, but there was comfort in returning to the work that had defined her time at the outpost. Sergeant Williams approached her as she worked, still moving carefully due to a minor wound he'd sustained in the fighting.
"Martinez," he said quietly, "I heard what you did.
How you warned us instead of helping them set their trap."
Sarah shrugged, focusing on her cooking. "It wasn't really a choice. You're my guys. I couldn't let them hurt you."
"Still," Williams continued, "what you did took real courage.
You could have been killed."
"So could all of you," Sarah replied.
"That's what made it easy."
Commander Blake joined them a few minutes later, carrying a cup of coffee and looking more relaxed than he had in days.
"Martinez, I've just gotten word from Base Command.
There's going to be a full investigation into the security breach that compromised our position."
"What does that mean for the outpost?"
"It means we're being relocated while the intelligence analysts figure out how much of our operations have been compromised," Blake explained. "This place is blown, and we can't risk staying here while enemy forces know our location." Sarah felt a pang of sadness at the news. Despite everything that had happened, this outpost had been her home for 8 months. She'd found purpose here, feeding men who'd become her family and proving to herself that she could handle responsibilities far beyond anything she'd imagined when she first enlisted.
"What about me?" she asked.
Blake smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him since the crisis began.
"You're coming with us, of course.
Agent Harrison has specifically requested that you be assigned to her security detail for the duration of the investigation."
Seems she was impressed by your performance under pressure.
As Sarah continued preparing breakfast for her extended family of warriors and spies, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. She'd started as a cook responsible for maintaining an empty outpost and ended as someone who'd helped prevent a major intelligence disaster. The morning sun streaming through the mess hall windows looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything else had changed. Team 7 was safe, their mission had been successful, and the network that had threatened them was being systematically dismantled by intelligence professionals. Sarah Martinez had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by the warriors on the front lines, but by the people who support them, feed them, and refuse to betray them when the stakes are highest. She'd been just a cook in the mess hall, but when her SEAL team needed her most, she'd found the courage to take action that saved their lives. As she served breakfast to men who were alive because of her choices, Sarah realized that she'd discovered something about herself she'd never known was there: the heart of a warrior, beating steadily in the chest of someone whose job was simply to make sure the real warriors were well fed.
It was a lesson that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead.